Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on protecting victims of human trafficking and online exploitation. I will recognize myself for an opening statement. Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to do the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm sorry. I'll ask this gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore, to lead us in the pledge. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. I appreciate everyone being here today. We're here to continue an extremely important discussion on protecting the most vulnerable members of our population. Through the 118th Congress, our subcommittee held 2 victims-focused hearings. We passed 2 pieces of legislation out of committee, and one of them ended up being signed into law. I look forward to continuing this work in the 119th Congress by spotlighting how to best protect victims of human trafficking and child exploitation and give a voice to these countless victims. Human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, is a heinous crime that tragically continues to grow in America. While international sex trafficking may be more widely known, domestic sex trafficking also persists in the United States. Traffickers even use social media to lure innocent people, including children, to become victims. In the United States, an adult or child can be trafficked and exploited at hotels, truck stops, their own homes, and online. Trafficking victims are exploited in cities, suburban, and rural areas. It can happen anytime and anywhere. Traffickers use fraud, force, and coercion to induce their victims to commit crimes. This can lead to the arrest, conviction, and incarceration of trafficked victims without consideration of their victim status. Thankfully, we as a country have and will continue to make significant progress to help victims and survivors move forward with their lives. We're also committed to protecting children and combating the growing issue of child sexual abuse material, CSAM. Identifying children depicted in CSAM is crucial to stop their ongoing victimization and capture offenders of producing it. More than 50,000 children in CSAM videos and images in the possession of law enforcement remain unidentified. It's tragic that so many children remain unknown, unfound, and unrescued. Last year, the committee worked with former members of Homeland Security Investigations, the main investigative body within DHS, and the prominent law enforcement agency combating human trafficking and child exploitation. We also heard from current and former Internet Crimes Against Children, ICAC, task force officers coordinating thousands of federal, state, and local enforcement agencies across the country combating CSAM. We also had powerful testimony from Tim Tebow, sharing the mission of the Tim Tebow Foundation and more about Operation Renewed Hope. Operation Renewed Hope is the first of its kind. It's joining federal law enforcement agencies with non-government organizations to identify, locate, and rescue victims of child exploitation. Thanks to these heroic efforts, over 300 victims were identified and at least 14 were rescued. I understand Operation Renewed Hope is ongoing, and I hope more victims continue to be rescued and provided with the care they need and deserve. There is no question these criminals must be prosecuted. While there are many solutions to combat these issues, we must assure prosecutors are doing their jobs to put these criminals behind bars. I express my gratitude to the special agents of HSI and ICAC task force officers for their unwavering commitment to safeguarding children and liberating victims from the atrocities of these crimes. I also thank NCMEC and the Tim Tebow Foundation. These groups are leading the charge to identify and rescue victims of human trafficking and CSAM, and for that we thank you. Sunshine's the best disinfectant, it has been said. It is the best way to rid the world of these predators who abuse and exploit victims. We will continue our work to deliver hope to those who need it most. Again, I thank those witnesses who are here and the members of the committee who are here and will come. And with that, I yield back and now recognize the ranking member, Ms. McBath, for her opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all of our witnesses this morning. Thank you to each of you for joining us today for our first hearing of the Subcommittee on Crime and Federal Government Surveillance in the 119th Congress. I welcome all of our subcommittee members, as Chairman said, that will also be arriving, and I truly hope that we can find common ground this Congress as we work to combat crime and make our communities safer. Most Americans probably think that we've never met a victim of human trafficking or online exploitation, that these crimes happen everywhere else. But the unfortunate reality is that more than 36 million reports of online child sexual exploitation were made in 2023, while reports of online enticement increased more than 300% in just 2 years. And human trafficking, a multi-billion-dollar industry that includes both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, has been reported in all 50 states. Before I became a member of Congress, believe it or not, I was a flight attendant. And I was trained to spot the signs of trafficking on board the airline, the planes. We were taught that if we saw someone in distress, we would reach out and help that person find safety if we could. This training continues today through the Department of Homeland Security's Blue Campaign, which educates people in key industries and the public to help identify victims of trafficking. But what happens after that victim is discovered, whether by a flight attendant, a doctor, a hotel manager, a friend, or a member of the community, what happens after that? Almost 25 years ago, Congress recognized that to combat human trafficking effectively, a system was needed that could help victims escape, get the support that they needed, and if they were willing, aid law enforcement in prosecuting their trafficker. With the help of trafficking advocates, Congress's solution was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, a bipartisan bill that invested in prevention, protection of victims, and prosecutions. But today, the entire system is in jeopardy. The current administration's chaotic and reckless approach to governing has put lives on the line by freezing funding and stopping the very critical work done by organizations that help victims and help survivors. These disruptions have already forced nonprofits to lay off employees. And while some organizations have had their funding restored, they still worry about how this administration might continue to undermine their work. If the president continues down this path and funding is cut for good, it will be trafficking victims and survivors who pay the price. Without shelters, where will these victims and survivors go? Without lawyers or social workers, who will advocate for them to make sure that they get the services that they need? Without assurances of safety, how will victims work with law enforcement in pursuing charges that might prevent a trafficker from reaching new victims? If this administration lets the system fail, victims will have nowhere to turn. And that is exactly what traffickers want. When victims feel like they have nowhere to go, traffickers can promise them safety, then turn on them to resume their exploitation. Now, I'm sure that there may be some out there who still think that this issue doesn't affect them. But the reality is that human trafficking and online exploitation, both in the United States and abroad, it harms all Americans. When the administration attempted to illegally dismantle USAID and froze State Department funding, U.S. anti-trafficking efforts were stopped around the world, efforts that protect Americans and the United States' interests. For example, USAID has been working to combat online operations in South Asia known as scam farms, which use forced labor to scam Americans. Democrats and Republicans have long been able to work together to combat human trafficking and online exploitation. At this moment, and I believe this is possible, but at this moment, we need our Republican colleagues to stand with us in calling on the administration to stop the chaos and stop the disruptions. Join us in protecting these very vital programs and organizations and their funding so that we can truly protect the victims and survivors of these reprehensible crimes. Now is not the time for us to cut off funding for law enforcement and safety reforms and safety efforts. Funding is absolutely necessary to combat these egregious crimes. And I yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. And I'm going to now introduce today's witnesses, and I appreciate you coming today. Starting with Ms. Jean Brugman. Ms. Brugman is the Executive Director of Freedom Network USA, a collection of advocates and survivors that advocate for and provide services to trafficking survivors. She previously served as a human trafficking fellow in the DOJ Office for Victims of Crime. Also is Ms. Basham. Ms. Ann Basham is the founder and chair of the Interparliamentary Task Force on Human Trafficking. The task force is a consortium of members of Parliament and Congress, government leaders, and survivors from more than 25 countries who work to stop human trafficking. Ms. Camille Cooper serves as Vice President of Anti-Human Trafficking and Child Exploitation at the Tim Tebow Foundation. She's worked for over 20 years on issues including child protection, child exploitation, and child trafficking. She previously served for 13 years as the Director of Government Affairs at the National Association to Protect Children, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting children from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And Ms. Sherry Lopez is a survivor of human trafficking and founder of Pearl at the Mailbox, a nonprofit organization that works to end child exploitation through prevention, education, and awareness. Her nonprofit is named for the woman who noticed that she was being trafficked and helped Sherry get free from her traffickers. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for appearing today, and we'll begin by swearing you in. Would you each please rise and raise your right hand? Do you each swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? The record will reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. Ms. Basham, we'll go to you first.
Thank you so much, Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member McBath, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Ann Basham, as he mentioned, and while there are many important relevant bills here in Congress right now, I am going to be focusing primarily on two, and that is the Trafficking Survivor Relief Act and the Gracie Act. Human trafficking is perhaps the worst human rights violation in the world, and yet instead of receiving protection and justice, many trafficking victims are arrested and convicted of crimes they were forced to commit. Survivors of human trafficking too often have their voices silenced by unjust felony convictions for crimes they committed as a direct result, I should restate, of their trafficking offenses. Traffickers often force their victims to commit crimes, and the resulting criminal records prevent survivors from obtaining housing, employment, and other essential elements for life. Currently, most states have legal mechanisms that allow survivors of trafficking to seek vacatur or expungement of their criminal records that are tied to their exploitation. However, there is no equivalent legal framework at the federal level. The Trafficking Survivor Relief Act, or TSRA as I'm going to refer to it, is sponsored by Representative Fry, Liu, and Wagner, and it actually passed through the House Judiciary Committee last year. It seeks to address this gap by providing a pathway for survivors to vacate convictions and expunge arrest records for certain crimes that were a direct result of their trafficking. Additionally, the bill allows for the Office on Violence Against Women to allocate funding for civil legal services and establishes, and this is very important, an affirmative defense for victims so that they can avoid unjust criminalization at the outset. In an appendix to my written testimony, which I would really encourage you to read, I have included survivor impact statements, including the story of Holly Nadell, who built an incredible career and was acknowledged as a trafficking survivor by the court. But she recently lost everything due to a wrongful felony conviction. What is most alarming is that for most of these adults who are convicted in their late teens or early 20s, this experience began actually when they were children. Research shows that the average age at which children are targeted for both sex and labor trafficking is just 11 to 14 years old. And more than 60% of child trafficking victims are current or former foster youth. The Gracie Act, which is Generate Recordings of All CPS Interviews Everywhere, was just introduced last week by Senator Blackburn and Senator Ossoff. And it incentivizes states to mandate audio or video recordings for all Child Protective Services or CPS interviews. It also provides necessary transparency and accountability to those who are on the front lines of protecting children. So I'm actually going to share with you the story that inspired the Gracie Act. Abby, as I'm going to refer to her, was a young girl. She was caught in a nightmare that too many children face. Her parents were divorced, and during a visit to her father's house, a quarrel escalated into physical violence, and this was a young child in elementary school. Abby's father grabbed her neck, the incident was reported to a counselor, and the case was referred to CPS. The caseworker actually interviewed Abby at her mother's home because school happened to be closed that day for snow. That's very typical. The mother listened to the story from the next room and recorded the interview. The mother told the investigator, or Abby told the investigator the same story she had told the counselor. However, the case was curiously dismissed. Months after the case closed, it was discovered that the official report distorted Abby's testimony, downplaying the assault as a mere grab to the arm, not the neck, an act which could have qualified as a felony under state law. Abby's voice was silenced. In the United States, 37.4% of children, that's more than 1/3 of all children, will be interviewed by CPS by the time they're 18. And without recordings, these children's testimonies can be easily misrepresented. So I actually have here a copy of the Congressional record. I know that you all know what this looked like, but for everyone else, this is just one day on the House floor. This is everything that was spoken. But what if you, as members of Congress, went to the House floor and you gave an important testimony and it was never recorded? What if there was only one witness in the hearing room, not a stenographer, but just an observer who recorded a personal analysis of your testimony? Would you take this personal analysis as an accurate record of your testimony? Do you want the most important statements of your life to be at the mercy of a stranger with a pen? So the lack of transparency and accountability within child welfare systems is appalling. Police are required to wear body cameras in most states, and the Department of Justice has mandated interrogation recordings since Eric Holder. But child victims are not afforded the same protections. So thank you so much. With that, I urge each of you to co-sponsor both of these bills, as well as the National Human Trafficking Database Act, the Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act, the SHIELD Act, the Renewed Hope Act, and the Take It Down Act. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Basham. Chair now recognizes Ms. Brugman for your 5-minute statement. Your microphone, please.
Thank you. Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member McBath, members of the committee and staff, and my fellow witnesses, thank you for the opportunity to discuss human trafficking in the United States. I'm Jean Brugman, Executive Director of Freedom Network USA, and an attorney with 25 years of experience addressing human trafficking. Freedom Network USA is the nation's largest coalition of anti-trafficking programs and a training and technical assistance expert. Our 98 members are NGOs and individuals. They are survivors, attorneys, researchers, teachers, doctors, and social service providers who work with over 6,000 trafficking survivors here in the United States every year. I've provided detailed recommendations in my written statement and will summarize those briefly now. Human trafficking is the result of policy choices. Industries like agriculture and domestic work, once dependent on enslaved labor, were left out of U.S. labor protections and are now rife with labor trafficking. Our immigration laws were established to exclude Asians and Africans. The criminalization of sex work was rooted in opposition to mixed-race couples. Enacting policies that protect all workers, value immigrants, and decriminalize sex work robs traffickers of their power. Young people are vulnerable to trafficking due to their developing brains and legal and physical dependence. If you add in poverty, insecure immigration status, sexual or physical abuse, or rejection by family or community, traffickers will swoop in. Providing care and support to all young people, including education on consent and healthy relationships, protects them from a range of abuse and creates safe places to seek help. The internet, social media, and cryptocurrencies are being used by traffickers, but also by survivors and providers. While we need safer online spaces, restricting access to information and shutting down sites with adult content only drives traffickers into hidden spaces out of the reach of legal authorities. Age and identity restrictions collect data that hackers steal. And far too many policies are used to block access to critical information and safety for queer communities. We need to pursue policies that protect everyone, not just a few. Both labor and sex trafficking survivors are left with criminal records as a result of their victimization. Our Survivor Reentry Project is currently supporting 137 survivors who have a total of 1,716 criminal charges. We're connecting them with pro bono attorneys in the 47 states that have criminal record relief, but for those with federal charges, there are no options. Enacting the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act is critical, but we must avoid the pitfalls we've seen in so many state statutes. It must include a broad range of criminal charges, reduced requirements, and meet the needs of real survivors. Over 25 years, the TVPA has remained impressively bipartisan. Funding for services has steadily grown, but let's be honest, still not that much. FY24 appropriations for the DOJ and HHS programs combined were only about $120 million. But they provide survivors with safe housing, medical and mental health care, legal services, and education. These programs not only meet the very real needs of survivors, but they also send a critical message. We see you. You did not deserve this abuse, and we will protect you. But last month's OMB memo threatened to end all funding in less than 48 hours. The HHS grants were on hold for weeks. Programs funded by the State Department and USAID, both in the US and abroad, have been canceled. Some programs have already enacted furloughs, halted hiring, or stopped accepting clients. If funding is not reliable, programs will close. Survivors will have to choose between staying with traffickers and homelessness, between abuse and hunger. Funding cuts enable traffickers to abuse and exploit US citizens and foreign nationals alike. Traffickers target the vulnerabilities of their victims. To combat them, we can't use a one-size-fits-all approach. We must meet the specific needs of each person. The executive orders on gender, DEI, and immigrants threaten this critical work. Guidance from the federal government to ignore gender identity and sexual orientation tells queer communities that they are not welcome in these programs. Eliminating services for undocumented immigrants leaves them dependent on the traffickers who control their visas and their debts back home. These orders are a blank check to traffickers and will lead to increased violence and abuse. Most anti-trafficking programs are embedded in community-based organizations like refugee resettlement agencies, runaway and homeless youth shelters, and queer community centers. They are a part of the fabric of our social safety net, and strengthening that net holds the key to not only supporting survivors, but preventing human trafficking in America.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Lopez for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member Macbeth, and members of the committee. I am honored to testify before you today on protecting victims of human trafficking and online exploitation. My name is Sherry Lopez, and I am a human trafficking survivor and founder of the nonprofit Pearl at the Mailbox, named in honor of a brave woman who rescued me from 7 years of trafficking at a mailbox. I share with you today's survivor's point of view. I grew up in a stable, two-parent home. I had just turned 15 and was trying to find my place in the world. I was an insecure and shy teen, which made me vulnerable to manipulation. I share this to shatter the preconceived notion that most children trafficked come from broken homes, are troubled, or are runaways. I was none of these. The reality is that any child can be groomed and trafficked. I met a boy in the drama club in high school, and he quickly introduced me to his father. Throughout 3 months, he groomed me and became my first trafficker. This began my 7 years of being sex trafficked. From the age of 15 to 18, I lived at home, and my parents had no idea what was happening to me, and I could not find the words to tell them that I was repeatedly being raped. This continued on the weekend and over the summer while I was in high school. There are many times I tried to stop what was happening. However, every rape had been recorded and used as blackmail to force me into submission, along with other threatening actions that were messages to me to comply. From the age of 18 until my rescue, I was flown across the United States and forced to do things I didn't want to do, but did because of fear of the consequences. And traveling on airplanes, nobody would have ever known I was a trafficking victim. Over time, my body operated on autopilot while I emotionally checked out to cope with the trauma. During my 7 years of being trafficked, I had 4 traffickers. One was a woman. See, a trafficked person has a shelf life. Once they are no longer useful to the trafficker is going to get rid of them, which could include being sold to another trafficker, such in my case, kicked out, resulting in many homeless teens, or they're going to be killed. Traffickers intentionally set out to destroy the will, heart, and soul of their victim and would not hesitate to take their life too if needed. When a victim gives up on life and their will to live is destroyed, the brain goes into self-preservation mode to keep the heart beating, even if the victim would rather die to end the abuse. Survival is in our DNA. Traffickers know this and use fear to gain and maintain control of their victim, beat down the will to live, and use the victim however it best fits the agenda of the trafficker. Human trafficker survivors are often the pawns of crimes masterminded by the traffickers and seen as throwaways who can take the blame. Many times, human traffickers are labeled as domestic violence victims and inadequately represented legally, and therefore easy to convict, a box that can be checked and a person to put behind bars, while the trafficker can afford better legal representation and receive a lesser charge or accountability for their role in forcing another person to participate in what they orchestrated. And let me share with you that it took over 25 years for me to grasp even what happened to me, to be able to put a name to it, and then it was anger that another person had the right to abuse another person in such fashion that I finally had to speak up. And now you cannot keep me quiet. I found my place in legislation. Last year, with the help of Representative Gress, I was able to get the Arizona vacator law updated and signed by the governor, which gives human trafficking survivors charged with prostitution or minor criminal offenses the ability to meet with a judge and potentially get those charges set aside. Also, I participated in a group with the help of Representative Bliss, Senator Bullock, and the guidance of Representative Wynn, which was Prop 313. And it was created by the Arizona voters on the ballot, and it was passed unanimously in the state. And what this does is it allows any adult who traffics a child under 15 is convicted with the charge will spend the rest of their natural life in prison without the possibility of parole. Why is this important? Because a trafficked survivor has a life sentence themselves. I will never get away from what happened to me. The life I had before is now gone. I respectfully ask that you support the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act. Doing so will give survivors hope that they can go forward and have a new life. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes now Ms. Cooper for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member McBath, and honorable members of the committee, thank you for having me back to speak again. My name is Camille Cooper, and I'm Vice President of Anti-Human Trafficking and Child Exploitation at the Tim Tebow Foundation. The Tim Tebow Foundation exists to bring faith, hope, and love to those needing a brighter day in their darkest hour of need. Our anti-human trafficking efforts span 52 countries around the globe. You have a few great bills before you this Congress: the Strengthening Child Exploitation Enforcement Act, the Protect Our Children Act reauthorization, the SHIELD Act, the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, and Representative Smith's reauthorization of TVPRA. For today, I'm going to focus most of my attention on the Renewed Hope Act, which addresses the need to identify and safeguard the 57,000 unknown children seen in crime scene photos that depict their rape and torture. Chairman Biggs and Representative Laurel Lee, thank you for your leadership and your assistance with that bill. 10 years ago, in a small town, a man started raping his 2-year-old stepdaughter. For our purposes, I'm going to call her Jane Doe. He filmed that abuse and shared it online with other pedophiles. The girl repeatedly disclosed her abuse, but she was not believed. For this little girl, the boogeyman was real, and he lived down the hall. For 10 years, Jane Doe suffered. In 2020, the number of children in the U.S. like Jane Doe that had their abuse images in the possession of law enforcement but had yet to be identified and safeguarded was 11,000. In 2022, the anecdotal information put that number at 20,000. In just 2 years, it had almost doubled. When I got to TTF, we put the protection of those children as our #1 priority, and we got to work. With the help of Timmy, John Rouse, Jim Cole, and the entire team at TTF, we hatched a plan. Bring all the experts in the world together with the goal of determining how many unknown victims were in the global image database at Interpol and operationalize a plan to find them. The result of that meeting led Homeland Security investigations to create the first ever victim identification task force in the United States and dubbed it Operation Renewed Hope. In the summer of 2023 and the winter of 2024, this task force tentatively identified over 730 children, including Jane Doe. To date, 289 of those children have been confirmed safeguarded. Almost half were American children. Operation Renewed Hope 3 is currently underway as we speak. Based on current data of actively traded series identified at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we know that family members are the largest category of offender in actively traded series, and of those, fathers produce more child sexual abuse images than any other type of offender category. According to law enforcement, children can be heard in these videos screaming for daddy to stop. In a study of unidentified victims of the Interpol database, they found that 84% of the images were of actual child sexual abuse, 47% contained extreme abuse, including rape, bondage, torture, defecation, and even bestiality. 4.3% of the images were infants. Due to the nature of online distribution, international collaboration with Interpol is essential in identifying and safeguarding American children. By way of example, the offender in Arizona rapes his child, films it, shares it with offenders in Spain or Germany. When those countries make an arrest and seize that offender's devices and analyze the images, they will find new victims, and those new victims' images go to Interpol's International Child Sexual Exploitation Database. Since its inception, 14,000 children, or almost half of the identified images in the ICSA database, have been American children, and this is why collaboration is so critical. If half of the unidentified children in Interpol's database are likely American victims, that means that a team of 7 at HSI's Cybercrime Center are tasked with finding tens of thousands of American victims. And that's why the Renewed Hope Act is critical. It will increase that full-time workforce from 7 to 200. Despite the success of Operation Renewed Hope, we cannot leave these remaining 56,000 children to languish. They need intervention, and they need it quickly. When Jane Doe was protected, this is what she said. When the police arrived at my house, I felt happy. I felt that something good will happen for me. God, I was thrilled. I wanted to smile because I knew something good will happen. It was magic. Today, the fate of 56,000 children is in your hands. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper, and thank all of our witnesses for their opening statements. Mr. Raskin, are you ready to go? So, Mr. Raskin, we'll recognize you for your opening statement.
Thank you very kindly for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, and greetings to our witnesses. Thank you for your testimony, which I know is harrowing and difficult in some cases, and I thank you for your public service. Trafficking is modern-day slavery, and it reflects a time of cruelty and barbarity when everything is for sale, not just public office and government, but human beings, people, women, children, laborers. And we know that labor trafficking, sex trafficking, the child sex abuse material are all flourishing online. Alas, the social media companies have been pushed to remove all guardrails against objectionable content on their platforms, which is called censorship. The result has not been a free speech utopia, but a dystopian nightmare. Social media has become a cesspool of scams targeting the elderly, cyberbullying aimed at children and linked to escalating suicide rates, misinformation exploiting the victims of disasters, natural and unnatural, racist and anti-Semitic hatred and vilification, and foreign disinformation and propaganda undermining democratic elections and social trust. And all of this has been a boon for the sex traffickers, while reduced content moderation has also led to an explosion of child sex abuse material online. So we want to prevent the government from becoming a barren hellscape like the social media platforms have become. We cannot allow them to dismantle the government programs and federal funding that actually protect children and teens and aid the victims of human trafficking. We rely on law enforcement and personnel from Homeland Security, the FBI, the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force program, which is a national network of 61 different task forces to target the people that are preying on children and women. Just last week, we learned that the Department of Homeland Security has ordered its entire investigative division, 6,000 agents, to stop focusing on drug dealers, terrorists, and human traffickers, and instead prioritize, you guessed it, immigration enforcement. So the child pornographers, the drug networks, and the human traffickers must be uncorking their champagne bottles about the diversion of all the other law enforcement resources to work on the mass roundup and deportation of immigrants. So we've got an entire ecosystem of groups working to help here. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which receives 81% of its funding from the federal government, does an essential job without federal funding and not-for-profits. And there are people determined to dismantle the federal funding. NCMEC and those that support victims by providing housing, emergency shelter, food, clothing, and so on, may have a much more difficult time being able to find the victims and survivors, the people who are willing to cooperate with investigations and prosecutions. My bottom line is I want to thank you for everything that you all are doing, and I hope that we will invest carefully in the public programs and the funded not-for-profit programs that are actually working to confront this nightmare in our time. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for my 5 minutes. Ms. Brugman, you're the Executive Director of Freedom Network, and so I assume you're familiar with your organization's finances and budget.
That's correct.
And will you please share with the committee the dollar amount Freedom Network received in grants from the federal government in 2023, please? If you don't have an exact number.
I don't have the exact number in front of me. I think that was in my disclosure form. We do have currently 3 grants and 1 sub-award. They're 3-year awards, so the funding is received but is to be used over the course of 3 years.
Yeah, and the 990 indicates that you received about $1.3 million, and that was about 87.7% of your funding.
That's correct.
Is that accurate?
That sounds like accurate.
So let's put those up. So you're getting nearly 90% of what you do funded by American taxpayers, and you advocate for legalization of prostitution. Is that fair?
We advocate for the decriminalization, Mr. Biggs. It is not the same as legalization.
And you also advocate for open borders, right?
We advocate for a safe way to allow migrants to move, to attain safety and support for themselves and their children,
And
yes.
so I have here a document from the National Center on Sexual Exploitation that protests your testimony today because the legalization or full decriminalization of commercial sex does two things: expands the trade, thereby expanding the demand for more prostitution, typically satisfied by manipulating vulnerable people, including youth and those experiencing poverty, homelessness, addiction, and undocumented status. And two, it prevents law enforcement from being able to identify sex trafficking victims, including minors. And so without objection, I introduce this letter and the packet from the National Center on Sexual Exploitation.
I would argue that
There's no question for you right now, Ms. Brugman. I'll go now to you, Ms. Lopez. The vacatur statute in Arizona that you worked on with Representative Gress in Arizona, that was to protect victims of trafficking who sometimes get caught up with committing crimes themselves. And so I wanted you to explain that and how you got that through.
Thank you for the question, Chairman Biggs. Yes, I like to find laws that are completely outdated and useless when it comes to protecting survivors. And the vacatur law was one of those in Arizona. It had an effective date of crimes prior to like 1987, something. So I presented it to Representative Gress, and I said, we need to update this because the issue that we have currently are survivors that were charged with prostitution because somehow automatically at the age of 18, somehow you're consenting to what's happening to you when you're really being trafficked. So you're charged with prostitution or some other petty crime, which is not uncommon for those that are hungry and the trafficker is controlling their aspects of eating or drinking, so they steal food to eat. And being able to update this law, which was supported unanimously through the House and the Senate on both sides, and now it allows survivors who have these charges to be able to fill out a form and request to meet with the judge and hopefully get those set aside so that way they can apply for background checks. Of course,
Then they get a clear record and they can live a normal life after that, to a certain extent.
Yeah, with the vacatur law, it's not expungement, so they still show up on a fingerprint clearance card.
Right.
Absolutely. Somehow catch up. Yes, but they can go on. It gives them hope. Somebody who maybe wants to be a teacher can now apply to be a teacher. Somebody who wants to be a nurse, such in my case, I became a nurse and I was able to do that.
Thank you for that, and I know that there's additional work to be done on Arizona's law as well, so we'll be talking about that. I want to go to you, Ms. Basham, for a moment. So human trafficking, child trafficking, that happens across border as well.
Correct.
So when you have misplaced 330,000 plus children, which the previous administration did through its ORR programs, those children, some being placed in sponsors who were running strip clubs, dozens going to the same address, same person without vetting, that makes them more vulnerable to human and sex trafficking.
Absolutely, yes.
My time has expired. Appreciate that. And I'm going to recognize now the ranking member, Ms. McBath, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In a memorandum dated January 27th, 2025, the Office of Management and Budget's acting director instructed the heads of all executive departments and agencies to effectuate a temporary pause on federal grants, loans, and other financial assistance. That's the OMB memo. Slated to begin the next day, January 28, 2025 at 5 p.m., the funding pause applied to 1, the issuance of new awards, 2, the disbursement of federal funds under all open awards, and 3, any other relevant agency actions that may be implicated by Trump's executive orders. Ms. Brugman, what did this memo mean for the organizations in the Freedom Network, and also what was the immediate response to this memo by members of your organization?
The response to the memo was widespread fear, confusion, frustration. Organizations, the funding that is issued by the federal government is reimbursement funding. So by cutting off the funding with such little notice, not only were people not able to determine whether they'd be able to continue serving folks going forward, but also weren't sure they were going to be paid the money that they were already due from the federal government. So immediately people within our network had to lay off staff and stopped accepting new clients, denying services and support to the very victims that we've been talking about this morning. And that includes legal services, housing, case management, assistance through the legal process to clear their criminal records. All of these services were immediately in great peril.
Thank you. How did your executive director of the Freedom Network anticipate this memo would affect victims and survivors of human trafficking?
Well, what we know is that when programs are not available, victims are stuck with nowhere to go. They stay with their traffickers. They're not able to access safe housing, alternative jobs, food, shelter, medical and mental health services, substance abuse services, all of the critical services that they need in order to leave the trafficking situation, heal, and then if they're pursue justice, either through a civil case or in working with law enforcement. Without those services and support, they remain in the traffickers' orbit and continue to be abused and exploited.
Let me ask, does your organization encourage prostitution or open borders? And please explain your position and why.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. We do not promote any form of work. What we promote are human rights. All workers deserve human rights. No one should be criminalized for the work that they do, either because they have no other choice or because it's the work that they choose. There is a full spectrum of reasons why people do any type of work. Not everyone is as privileged as myself to choose to do legal work in a safe office. For those who are left with choices that are less safe, we have to improve their safety. That is the approach we take to all other sectors of the workforce, and we should take that same approach with sex work as well. Improve the safety.
The Bipartisan Trafficking Victims Protection Act was first signed into law by President Clinton in 2000 and has since been reauthorized a number of times. Can you please explain how and why the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was first developed?
Absolutely. At the time in the 90s, there were a host of cases of forced labor and sex trafficking that involved a lot of extreme psychological coercion. The laws we had on the books at the time did not recognize these types of force, fraud, and coercion. At the same time, there were no programs for the survivors. And so they were trapped within the trafficking situation. Many trafficking victims are living with their traffickers. And so leaving the trafficker means needing a safe place to live. And so in recognizing both that survivors needed better services in order to rebuild their lives and to engage with the legal system, the TVPA was created to accomplish both of those goals.
I have one more question for you. Where do any gaps in services to victims and providers exist, if there are any, and how could legislation effectively address those gaps?
There are many
Ladies,
gaps.
time has expired, but you may answer the question.
Thank you so much. There are many gaps remaining. We need more funding. We need more support. We need to be allowed to really identify communities most at risk and direct our programs specifically to their needs, to their experiences, and to their situation. We need more housing, medical care, mental health care, case management services are always critical.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record a research brief from the ACLU titled, "Is Sex Work Decriminalization the Answer?" What the research tells us, a comprehensive review of more than 80 studies on the decriminalization and criminalization of sex work, which revealed there is no clear
Okay,
link
so
between
you
criminalizing
can
sex work and
do
stopping human
yours,
trafficking.
but if you want to read from it like I did, next time you need to do it in your 5 minutes, which is what I did. So we're going to go with Mr. Tiffany for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Cooper, how can social media companies help? I view, especially with young males, that pornography is kind of a gateway drug to stuff like this that happens. How could the social media companies help? And have you identified ways that they could be to stem the tide of this proliferation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. It's a great question. Under our current legal framework in the United States, social media companies have to report CSAM that they find on their networks, but only if they see it. So they don't have to proactively look for it, and I think that proactive detection is probably the most significant action that technology companies could take in this country to look for the material and then remove it. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is a lot of the social media companies like Meta provide encryption on their services like WhatsApp, and WhatsApp CSAM is proliferating across that particular application because it's encrypted and it provides safe harbor for pedophiles all over the world.
Have any states taken action? First of all, I'm not sure the legality. Can they have any states taken action in this regard?
Some of the states are looking at things like age assurance and age verification issues to be able to block content for minors. But then some states are looking at ways to be able to sort of block the efforts of the Internet Crimes Against Children task forces by preventing them from being able to collect what's called attribution data in their investigations. So you kind of have both things happening at the state level. It's a bit of patchwork. So we have some laws that have been passed, like in Utah, that have problems. And we have some laws that are passed in other states that are working towards like age verification.
Thank you. Ms. Lopez, is prostitution a component of human trafficking in your experience?
Well, it is a result of being trafficked. It's not a choice by the victim.
But it's a component of human trafficking.
It
oftentimes.
is, absolutely,
Is that right?
because somebody is paying for a service.
Yeah. Is it helpful to your cause to encourage prostitution?
No,
It is not helpful.
to encourage prostitution.
Yes. That does not help
No.
to limit human trafficking. Is that right?
Well, if you're saying that prostitution is okay, it opens the door for anybody to say, okay, well, I'm going to save this child who's 17, but looks like they're 21. Let's go ahead and prostitute them, and we're not going to be held liable.
So in other words, legalizing prostitution is not going to be helpful to your cause.
No, not at all.
Ms. Basham, are you familiar with something referred to as rape trees? Microphone.
No, not extensively.
Okay, so when I was down to Arizona on one of the trips with Mr. Biggs, an Arizona sheriff shared how the gangs, if I recall this correctly, they would hang a woman's underwear when they would bring her in from a foreign country and when they were trafficked into the United States. Those were rape trees. I'm sorry to have to share it in such explicit terms, but is it helpful to secure the southern border to prevent some human trafficking in the United States of America?
Well, let me give you this analogy. If you take excellent care of your children in your house, you are going to lock your door at night. And I believe very firmly that, first of all, a lot of these children, we know this now, we are not in the dark. They are being raped along the journey here. It's a horrific set of circumstances that they are facing here. And by not by having porous borders, what it actually ends up doing is it becomes a push-pull factor, and it actually encourages this. The biggest thing with human trafficking in general is it's a crime. It's very different than every other human rights abuse because it's not just slavery. It is slavery, but human trafficking is actually at its core part of the advanced criminal networks. And that's why it's such a big deal, and it is part of this committee explicitly. So yes, I absolutely believe that every country needs to have authority over their borders, and I believe that there should be no incentivization for someone to try to cross those borders, because otherwise what you get is you get children who are caught in the middle and they become the commodity.
So securing our borders will help prevent human trafficking.
Absolutely.
I yield back.
Thank you. We've been called to votes. I think there's just one vote. I would urge us to go over, vote quickly, and come back. I'm trying to poll, see who's available to come back. I think most everybody can. So I'd ask the witnesses to stay close. We're going to go into recess until 10 minutes after the vote. So probably 20 to 30 minutes, somewhere in there. So with that, we're going to be in recess.
I've never had that. I was like, have you had that happen before? I've never had that happen.
Subcommittee is called back to order. Others are on their way back from voting. Thank you for all for being here. And the chair recognizes the ranking member of the entire committee, Mr. Raskin, for his 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. The most famous child sex trafficker of our time, I venture a guess, is Jeffrey Epstein, a man of extraordinary wealth, power, influence, and connection, a good friend of Donald Trump's, actually, and other politicians who used his resources in order to exploit girls. And I'm wondering if, Ms. Brueggemann, perhaps you could start, if you would explain basically how sex traffickers work and how they are able to get access to underage girls and to exploit them for their purposes.
Thank you for the question. Sex traffickers work in many different ways to target vulnerabilities of the individuals they're targeting to exploit. So for young people, it's often through grooming, through approaching them and offering things that they're not getting at home. Whether
so in his case, he had a woman, I think her last name was Maxwell, who worked with him, and then she would procure the girls by giving them gifts of money or clothing or invitations to parties, that kind of thing.
My understanding is, yes, that there were people were being approached and offered financial rewards and benefits, an opportunity to come to parties, but we're not told exactly what was being expected of them, what would happen once they arrived, and then they had difficulty to not consent to what was happening and were entrapped in that situation.
Yeah, and so they tended to be poor or vulnerable from a more like a broken home or dysfunctional family situation, right?
Yeah, I think what we've heard from our witnesses is that people are targeted in different ways. So it might be because they were low income, it might be because they have an insecure immigration status, it might be because they're queer and not being respected by their communities, it might be because they're seeking validation and love and attention. So there are lots of ways to target folks.
Okay, so you had an interesting colloquy about the law of prostitution. I know that's not what this is about, but I'm just wondering, did the law criminalizing prostitution and putting women in jail for prostitution help any of the girls who were trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein and his network?
Exactly, no. The criminalization of people engaging in the selling of sex does not help anyone. It makes them more vulnerable, more at risk, and unable to come forward for assistance if they do experience abuse and exploitation. And the criminal records, as we've heard, follow them throughout their entire lives.
Okay, I've got an article I'd like to submit for the record about Elon Musk's business empire is built on $38 billion in government funding.
Without objection.
If I could, from the Washington Post. That's a lot of money. People are getting a lot of money from the U.S. government for different purposes, and I hope that our oversight committee will be able to ferret out the waste, fraud, and abuse in a lot of these programs, But how much money, you were asked the question, how much money does your organization get? And I know you're a consortium of how many different organizations?
Right, so we do have 89 different members. We also have staff ourselves, so we receive direct federal funds in order to run a program to help survivors clear their criminal records. We provide training and technical assistance to housing providers, and we're also working on other training and technical assistance programs. And then our members have different funding that they get directly.
And so how much money did you get in government grants and funds?
So we get the amount, as Mr. Biggs pointed out, I think it was around $2 million in that one grant
billion?
year. Million.
Oh, 2 million,
Oh, no,
okay.
yes.
Because I was talking about Musk with 38 billion, and you said
Nice.
2 million for all of the consortium of...
Over a period of 3 years.
So perhaps I come to you, Ms. Lopez. What would the effect be of actually demolishing government funds, grants to all of these organizations? There are some people who just want to shut it all down, and what would that mean?
I can't speak to other organizations, but I can tell you Pearl at the Mailbox will never accept government grants.
And how come you don't accept government grants?
because we want to be able to continuously employ the people that we choose to employ, and we don't want to be beholden to another agency that tells us what to do.
Okay, and Ms. Cooper, what do you think the effect would be of a shutdown in government funding?
Well, I think anti-human trafficking and child exploitation efforts have been historically underfunded. So really, we need more funding for enforcement efforts, for demand reduction. But I think that it's really important to clarify that there's good funding and there's bad funding. And good funding needs to go to support law enforcement. It needs to go to support survivor care. It needs to go to support legal services. But bad funding would be funding that supports the full decriminalization, and that means funding that supports decriminalizing brothel keeping, pimping, and sex buying. What we need is an increase in efforts to enforce those third-party profiteers that profit from prostitution.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all the witnesses being here today. You know, I understand Pam Bondi said that they're going to release the flight logs of the Lolito Express, Jeffrey Epstein's planes coming out today, and we're asking for them to be unredacted. We want to know who was on the flights. I understand there were 200 victims in that process. We will indeed get to the bottom of that. I'm grateful President Trump has the courage and the willingness to put the names on a list and let everybody know what was going on this island that Epstein owned. But anyway, Ms. Basham, can you maybe break down the funding the trafficking funding that was put in by 45, President Trump, as opposed to the Biden administration? What were the differences in the budgets we spent on anti-trafficking between those administrations? Do you know off the top of your head?
Yeah, I know some of that off the top of my head. And so just as a background, I did used to work at the Department of Justice, was in senior leadership there, actually at the Office for Victims of Crime, which is the largest federal funder of domestic anti-trafficking efforts in the nation. So I can tell you this, that under the last year of the President Trump's administration in 2020, it was allocated that over $100 million in a single fiscal year just from the Department of Justice for domestic anti-trafficking efforts. This is the largest ever given in any administration. And I do agree with Representative McBath when she said at the beginning that anti-trafficking efforts need to be prioritized. That's absolutely the case. Additionally, $35 million was allocated for shelters. Shelters, as Ms. Bruggeman mentioned, are one of the most essential parts to the recovery of survivors of trafficking. They are the foundation. We have got to have funding for shelters. Since that time, the funding has dropped to about half, many years less than half of that $35 million, and it has never come back up. And that's with inflation. That's
so
with
the
soaring
Biden
inflation.
administration, even with inflation, cut funding to less than half than what President Trump was spending. So explain to me the shelter. Now, how is that such an integral part? We won't, you don't have to go in detail because I got some other questions I want to ask Ms.
sure.
Cooper and some of the others, but how does that help the process? Does it just get folks off the streets? Is that kind of what happens?
Yeah, you have to have safe shelter. Any survivor of trafficking, a lot of times when they leave, they are in a very dangerous situation. They need a place that's safe, and they actually need a place with wraparound services so that they can fully recover and then move on with their lives. And that usually takes at least a year, sometimes 2 years for long-term care.
Ms. Cooper, you mentioned the unidentified 56,000 children, I believe was the number you told us, where these kids, we know they've been victimized by family members or whatever the case may be, which is incredibly tragic. Do you think facial recognition will help? Is that something down the road that our law enforcement agents will be able to use to try to identify these children and get them out of those harmful situations?
Yeah, actually, facial recognition is a game changer for that purpose because children's faces are in the photographs, and I think that it's led to quite a number of successful identifications and rescues of children that have been seen in that database. So Homeland Security investigations, the FBI, all of our federal and state partners need to be able to have permission to use that technology. It's a game changer.
Good. How much money do you get, or your organization, the TBO organization, get from the federal government?
Nothing.
Not a dime. But y'all are, what, $30 million a year, I think, is your budget, is that right?
Yeah, our budget's significantly higher than that because we do have some organizations that are sort of subsidiaries of us. So I think that right now we're at about $50 million
Thank you, and tell Ms. Tebow we appreciate your efforts. Ms. Lopez, Pearl at the mailbox. Wow, what a name. Tell me, how does that work? I know you only got about, 60 seconds or so, but tell me a little bit about Pearl at the Mailbox and what you do in your organization.
Mailbox, we work on prevention. There's many organizations that work on the post-rescue, but there's not a lot of people working on the prevention side. If we can teach people to spot it and stop the grooming process, we have a better chance of protecting children from going into trafficking.
How do parents and grandparents, what is one of the signs that you think that we maybe as parents and grandparents might miss? What is something that, I know you need to be involved in your children's lives, and we certainly are, but tell me, is there a certain thing that you recommend, maybe a 2 to 3 bullet points, hey, here's what parents and grandparents need to be looking for?
You know, in my case, I would always say, and other survivors, it's the behavior that changes before ever words are ever used to say what's going on. If a child is behaving differently, wanting to spend more time away from home, maybe have new friends, just things to look at. And we've lost our ability to listen to our intuition, and we kind of forget that, okay, maybe we need to pay attention because something's not right in our home. But I say that the schools is the missing link. We don't have enough prevention education in our schools.
Thank you, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. And now I want to include into the record without objection an acknowledgement of the good work of Mr. Goldman when he was prosecuting and breaking up an international sex trafficking conspiracy, apparently. So that was good work, and I want to highlight that for you, Mr. Goldman. With that, yield 5 minutes to you.
I thank you very much for that, Mr. Chairman.
Actually, I'm going to rescind that yielding because Mr. Cohen got here just in the nick of time before you started, and I had promised him he could go next.
You stand by the praise, nonetheless.
Yes, I stand by the praise. I stand by the praise, and
As long as you reiterate it again before I go.
I know you like that stuff. So, Mr. Cohen, yield to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I listened to your testimony and appreciate your issue, and I've got a bill on the SOAR bill, which you may know, but Ms. Basham didn't mention it, and I think in a list of bills she mentioned. But I want to ask each of you, have any of y'all heard of either Andrew or Tristan Tate? Ms. Brugman, what do you know about Andrew and Tristan Tate?
I understand that they're accused of sex trafficking internationally, and there's questions about their jurisdiction and their freedom of movement at this time.
Thank you. Anybody else know about them? Ms. Cooper, what do you know about them?
I just am aware of what I read in the news, that there's several cases pending.
And they are social activists and whatever they call them,
Influencers, correct.
Right, and they were, they're no longer having their travel restricted. They were allowed, given their U.S. passports back today, and they flew on a plane allegedly straight to Fort Lauderdale. There is allegations that there was involvement from our administration, the Trump administration, that got Romania and pressured Romania to release them. They've got some pretty serious charges against them for rape and sex trafficking in Romania and also, I think, in England. What do you think the odds of them returning to Romania are after they've been released with their U.S. passports? Ms. Brugman?
My assumption would be very low.
Yeah, thank you. And anybody else have an opinion? Well, that just happened today. It's pretty startling what they've done. They're dual U.S. UK citizens, and not good folks. Let me ask you, are y'all familiar with, where's my, here I am. Are you familiar with any grants that have been restricted by the Trump administration here in the executive orders that affect your particular area, Ms. Brugman?
Yes, there were grant funding from HHS for direct services for trafficking victims that were halted for about 2 weeks, leaving providers without access to funding and uncertain if they would be able to continue supporting those survivors with housing, food, medical care, legal services, And also, we've seen halting of funding internationally from USAID and the State Department that have ended critical human trafficking work internationally, but also that we're hiring survivors here in the United States as consultants and experts in developing those programs who have lost their livelihood when their contracts were canceled.
And this would be damaging to arresting sex traffickers in the future, would it not?
Absolutely. Without building that capacity and that expertise based on the knowledge of survivors, we're unable to actually effectively stop trafficking, labor, and sex trafficking. Any restriction, any halting, any stopping of that work, of that critical work, is a gift to traffickers.
Any of the other ladies familiar with any grants that might be held up? No. Ms. Brugman, you've been an expert in this. Do you think your being an expert in this area makes you more likely to be aware of these issues than if you were an expert in rocket propulsion or electric cars?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. The DOJ office that administers the Office of Victims of Crime and the Office of Violence Against Women and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency, all of which fund important anti-trafficking exploitation programs, they've been threatened to be slashed as well. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, sir. We're very concerned about the ideas that those offices, the staff would be slashed. We need those staff to help administer these grants and make sure that the funding continues to move forward, that everything is reviewed and programs are provided with the support they need.
And when we look at budgeting, and we've been given by the judiciary areas of over $100 million to look at budgeting, do you think these areas are more important to stop sex trafficking than building a border wall?
I do.
Thank you. I'd like to mention my bill that I had introduced to reauthorize the SOAR Act, which was to give people training to identify people that have been sex trafficked. It was law. We got it passed through the House. It stopped in the Senate for funding problems, but it's been reintroduced. And I hope that y'all would encourage your senators to support it. It failed last time for whatever reason. And the House had passed through pretty much unanimously. It was successful between September 2017 and 2023. They hosted more than 200 events and trained over 260,000 healthcare professionals across the country. So thank you very much, and thank you for your testimony.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. As we've held hearings on this topic the last few years, the numbers, the scale of the problem continues to be absolutely horrifying, and it's particularly alarming, the prevalence of these horrors here in the United States and the number of victims. I do think there is some cause for encouragement that we have an opportunity to start to turn a corner and to help prevent these crimes and to help victims and to stop there from being even more victims going forward. One reason, of course, is that we have an entirely different situation at the border, which was connected to this problem. A second reason is that I think there is a growing realization that we need to use the full force of the criminal code to hold traffickers accountable. I'll give you one quick example of that. In my state of California, there was a bill that said, well, I think we should classify trafficking of a minor as a violent offense, as a serious felony. Incredibly, the state's Assembly's Public Safety Committee initially voted not to do that. They said, no, this is not going to be considered a serious crime. However, the public backlash was so great that they eventually reconvened and held a re-vote, and that bill made it all the way through and was signed into law by the governor. So now it actually is considered a serious felony with real consequences in California, and I think that there's more we need to do under both state law in California as well as under federal law. A third area that is very important and was mentioned by Ms. Lopez is education, and actually a good law that we have in California is one that is designed to promote prevention education in schools. There's an organization based near my district, Three Strands Global, that has pioneered a lot of very good education efforts in classrooms. And then finally, I've introduced the National Human Trafficking Database Act. This is a piece of bipartisan legislation Mr. Johnson on this committee, is a co-author. What this would do is establish a national human trafficking database at DOJ, as well as incentivize certain state law enforcement agencies to report to the database. And so reported data would include data that indicates the presence and prevalence of human trafficking for every county and every state, the names of all anti-trafficking organizations operating in each county, the total number of state-level human trafficking organizations collected in coordination with local DAs, and then, as I mentioned, it would also incentivize states to submit this data by directing DOJ's Office for Victims of Crime to award grants to states to collect and submit the data, authorizing $50 million per fiscal year. I also want to thank Ms. Hageman, also on this committee, for authoring this bill with me as well. So I believe, Ms. Basham, you mentioned this issue in your testimony. So maybe if, Ms. Lopez, if you wanted to just expound on the education, the importance of the education piece of this, and then Ms. Basham as far as the data collection goes.
Education is key, and that seems to be what's lacking. And if you spend resources to educate individuals about what human trafficking is and the grooming process that leads to trafficking, people have the ability to understand it. We teach our children how to drive cars, and it's a process before they get a license. So why are we not teaching the children how to spot when somebody is trying to harm them, such as a predator, whether it be in person or online? That is lacking throughout all of our country, and specifically in Arizona, we can't get these programs in our schools. So we need to focus on education for prevention purposes.
Thank you so much. There are two key reasons why data is important, and specifically this National Human Trafficking Database Act. The first is it actually funds state law enforcement. And as we all know, law enforcement tends to be historically underfunded, and especially when it comes to trafficking. They just don't have enough resources. So it actually brings the money directly where we need it most so that every state in the nation can have that money for their state law enforcement. The second thing is the word data, unfortunately, is not an exciting word. There is an adrenaline with it, but those numbers represent individuals. Data are people. And so every single number is a person. And the number one biggest gap, in my opinion, in trafficking is that victim identification. It sits at about 0.4%. So over 99% of victims are never identified. And the National Human Trafficking Database Act helps us to see what we're not currently seeing.
Thank you very much for your work and your advocacy, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Raskin, you have some UCs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The girls were just so young, the horrors of Jeffrey Epstein's private island. That's Vanity Fair. And listen to the Jeffrey Epstein tapes. I was Donald Trump's closest friend in the Daily Beast.
Without objection? And also, without objection, Mr. Fry will be permitted to participate in today's hearing for the purpose of questioning the witnesses if a member yields time for that purpose. And now, are you ready, Mr. Goldman?
Ready.
Okay, we'll yield time to you, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You are right. I supervised sex trafficking cases in the Southern District of New York. And based on that experience, as well as 10 years of experience prosecuting other cases, I can say with great certainty that victims of sex trafficking in particular are the most traumatized and stigmatized and difficult witnesses. And I don't mean difficult in presenting difficulties, but that it is incredibly difficult to have victims feel comfortable coming forward to testify, which often is required in order to hold people accountable. I just want to make sure that we are all in agreement here that federal funding is essential to fighting online exploitation and sex trafficking. Ms. Lopez, do you agree with that?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I think
I know you don't take it, but I mean, you don't accept it, you said, but you do support the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Prevention Training Act, do you not?
I do, and I believe there's a place for federal funding.
All right, I just want to make sure. Ms.
Yes.
Cooper?
The right kind of federal funding, so funding that
Ms. Basham?
supports.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I assume Ms. Brueggemann as well?
Yes, of course.
Now, Ms. Brueggemann, tell me a little bit about how online exploitation of victims occurs and also influences the willingness of other victims to come forward.
Sure. Online exploitation happens in a lot of different ways as technology continues to evolve. And online services are used for both labor and sex trafficking. So recruiters use online spaces in order to recruit workers with false promises of jobs and then bring them in and traffic them throughout our country. Sex traffickers also use online spaces to identify and groom people. We're talking in games, in apps, in online chats. And then also use online spaces to share, advertise, and sell.
Right, it's a very common method for sex traffickers to prey on victims, right?
Absolutely. As our society has moved online, so have the criminals.
Right, and so if there were a social media king, for example, who has expressed support for sex trafficking, would that be a concern of sex trafficking victims in your experience?
I would think absolutely yes.
Well, I just want to put up a photo here. This is Elon Musk in 2014 with Ghislaine Maxwell. Mr. Raskin had mentioned Ghislaine Maxwell was the right-hand person for Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking operation of minors. And we spoke, Mr. Cohen spoke earlier, and I want to return to this, about these individuals, Andrew Tate and Tristan Tate. They were charged in December of 2022 with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, rape, including minors, money laundering, and organized crime charges. In March of 2024, the British police obtained an arrest warrant for them based on an investigation into rape and human trafficking. And if anyone wants to go online and get a sense of this Andrew Tate, you should. So I can't quote almost anything he says because it is so vile and misogynistic that it is not appropriate for a morning television show. Last week, there was an article in the Financial Times about how the Trump administration was pressuring Romania to lift restrictions on the Tate brothers and to allow them to leave Romania. And lo and behold, what do you know? Just today, they were released from house arrest, given their passports back, and flew on a private plane to Florida. And I can assure you they will never return to Britain or Romania to face these charges. For 5 years, Andrew Tate's account on Twitter was banned. But when Elon Musk took it back over in November 22, he reinstated him and gave him a social platform to continue their sex trafficking and their illegal conduct. And Mr. Chairman, I think we ought to take a very close look at these social media companies and their role in the online exploitation of sex trafficking.
Thank you, gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the whole committee, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you having this hearing today, and I'm going to yield my time to the gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Biggs, for having this hearing. I want to dive in. Ms. Basham, you dedicated most of your career to combating human trafficking, and I think no one would question your expertise in this field. How many human trafficking cases are prosecuted at the federal level in this country?
Yeah, so in 2023, it was around 1,000, and the year before that, it was around 1,600.
And during these prosecutions and your review of them, do you think that there are adequate protections for victims of human trafficking who may have been forced to commit nonviolent crimes by their traffickers?
No, there's a huge gap.
Do you think that that is a serious problem in our federal system of laws that we don't have those protections?
Absolutely, and I think it's covered in several fold. One, through the vacatur and expungement, as I mentioned, but also through providing civil legal services at the federal level and allocating funding through the Office on Violence Against Women.
So that being said, this year, I reintroduced the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, along with colleagues that really span the ideological spectrum. This is a truly nonpartisan piece of legislation. Is there, with that particular legislation, would that close some of the loopholes in our legal system and provide adequate protections for victims?
Absolutely. And one of the other ones I want to mention is the right for affirmative defense from the outset. So that is one of the biggest reasons, one of the biggest questions is why would someone, be deemed both a victim of trafficking by the court and then at the same time want their crimes vacated? Well, the reason is that oftentimes they don't have the right to have that affirmative defense. And that affirmative defense is what makes it crystal clear to the judge and to the court from the beginning. It lets them really look at the case and say, is this a victim of trafficking? Instead, what happens is the crime is being prosecuted. So DOJ or whoever puts prosecutors who are, used to prosecuting white-collar crime. Like, they're not used to prosecuting necessarily trafficking cases. So they're focused on the crime, usually money laundering, bank fraud, those sort of things. And so when the focus is on that, then through the process, the victim actually, the survivor bubbles up, the real story bubbles up. And at that point, they're looking at two different things. And so that's what's really a huge problem. And so the affirmative defense is so critical, and that's what it really establishes from the outset.
Correct.
That's part of it.
And to be clear, I think most of our states, close to 50, have this at the state level.
Absolutely. I think it was 40, it might be 49 now. I think one state just crossed that finish line. And that is the biggest precedent that we have for this, because there are more trafficking convictions that actually fall at the state level. And we've seen that for over 10 years. So we've seen that actually states that implement this, they are not overrun with cases. And additional to that, they've actually strengthened, as Sherry mentioned, a lot of states like Arizona, they have actually strengthened their laws over the years.
Right, and this is obviously, so this legislation, nonpartisan, obviously, 49 states have it, approaching 50. So when you look at, obviously it's pro-victim because it provides that affirmative defense, but it's also pro-prosecution, right? This is why prosecutors and sheriff associations, and they love it too, because, and why is that? Why do you think that they would want something of this magnitude?
It makes their job easier.
Correct, because they're able at that point to go after the real culprits, right? The real individuals who are behind the trafficking victim and go after these rings.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, if I'm only going to probably take 3 minutes. If you want 2 more of mine, Mr. Fry. You sure? Okay.
Yeah, I just have a couple of UCs real quick, okay? First of all, I'd like to introduce in the record this image. We'll get you the hard copy. Mr. Epstein, Ms. Maxwell, and President Clinton. Also, I've got another article called "Schumer Got Thousands in Donations from Jeffrey Epstein." Without objection, those will be admitted. And Mr. Swalwell, your 5 minutes now.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. And look, as we have trafficking victims testifying to us about really important issues, I think it's insulting to them to try and bring in politics right before I question them. Look, we'll see whatever is on the Epstein list if the full list is released, but I'm here to get serious things done, and so my line of questioning will not be absurd in the spirit of what was just said. And Ms. Lopez, thank you for sharing your story as well. I was a prosecutor. I've had child sex trafficking victims testify. It's one of the hardest things in the world to convince them to confront their attacker, their assailant, their trafficker in court, and more cases plead out because you want them to avoid doing that. And so these monsters typically don't get the full sentence they deserve because you're trying to protect the victim from having to go through cross-examination and seeing that individual in court. So thank you for sharing that. Ms. Bruggerman, could you share with us what would happen to organizations that help victims and provide support to victims and survivors of trafficking and exploitation if the temporary restraining order holding back this administration's order is lifted?
Which, the order on the halting of funds?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, the service providers depend on a variety of different sources of funding, and I think the witnesses have talked about the different sources that they're familiar with. It is a web of protection that is woven with federal funds, private dollars, donations, earned income, that nonprofits around this country are working every day to ensure that they are able to provide consistent, reliable, dedicated services and support. When that is interrupted, even for a week, for a month, the message to survivors is, we cannot be relied upon. The day that you are able to find the time, the effort, the strength, the ability to escape your situation may be the day that our doors are closed. And once you do that, you may never be able to come out again. So if we allow our providers to close their doors, to go dark, we are inviting traffickers to walk in the door, to hold survivors captive, and we are telling survivors that we no longer care about your safety, we no longer care about your security, and we do not care whether or not you're able to ever escape your abuse and exploitation. We just can't let that happen.
Thank you, Ms. Bruggerman. And I imagine all of you know this, especially Ms. Lopez, but in my experience as a prosecutor, I was trained in law school and through the training that the district attorney's office provided to prove cases beyond a reasonable doubt. Of course, you want to have compassionate people, doing the job of criminal prosecution, but I could never have done my job unless I had outside organizations who were working with the victim in all of the life issues outside the legal issues that needed to be addressed. When they are pulled away from the trafficker and they need to reestablish their lives, get their confidence back, get their health back, receive the mental health services that they certainly need, to get a career if they have children. A prosecutor can't do that. And the only way to hold these monsters accountable who are trafficking them is for a prosecutor to have a victim who wants to be at least somewhat a part of the process. And so your organizations help us bring accountability. And accountability puts the worst people away and prevents the next victim from being trafficked, but it also is a deterrent to someone who will see that you will pay if you do this to a victim. So again, to each of you, thank you for what you do in this cause. Our victims are worthy of your support, and I hope that we can see any funding that's been pulled to be restored immediately, and I yield back.
Okay, thank you. For the record, Shared Hope International, Congressman Linda Smith was the architect of TVPA, and I introduced that, and she's here today. Thank you for being here. And the fact sheet on combating demand and harmful impact of decriminalization of anti-trafficking also entered into the record without objection. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I, too, am a former prosecutor and served as the lead prosecutor on the Child Exploitation Task Force while I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Tampa. So I have seen firsthand both the horrible crimes that are perpetrated against our country's most vulnerable children, and also how vital the work by federal agents and others in investigating and prosecuting these cases truly is. As a member of Congress, I am committed to ensuring that we do everything that we can to stop the sexual exploitation and trafficking of children and to stop these predators. Ms. Cooper, it has indeed been a pleasure and an honor to work with you and the Tim Tebow Foundation on the Renewed Hope Act. You mentioned earlier in your testimony, this bill is designed to provide resources and training and also requiring the Child Exploitation Investigations Unit and HSI field offices to hire an additional 200 computer forensics specialists and criminal analysts because these units are a dedicated team of investigators who can play a crucial role in combating human trafficking. I appreciate the bipartisan support of many members of this committee and the chairman's leadership on this legislation. You touched on something earlier, though, that we need to revisit, and that is you said the words, the right kind of federal funding. So clearly, the Renewed Hope Act, to find these specialists and add to them to supplement the team doing this important work is indeed adding additional federal employees of a certain type and specialty who can help rescue these children and stop these predators. But I'm interested, Ms. Cooper, how much does the Tim Tebow Foundation receive in federal funding?
We do not receive any federal funding at all.
And how many victims has Operation Hope identified?
Tentatively identified 730 and safeguarded and, rescued, I believe it's 289.
So I think it is important for this committee hearing to note that your foundation is doing that kind of extraordinary work in partnership with federal agents, but not by surviving on federal funds. In fact, you have received no federal funds to do the important work that you were doing to stop child exploitation. Now, would you tell us if we had those additional 200 agents at HSI, what you believe we could accomplish?
Yeah, absolutely. So over 25 days, they've tentatively identified 730 of the 57,000 children that are waiting and languishing in abusive situations and hoping that someone is going to, knock on that door. So imagine what we could do with 200 full-time investigators and victim identification specialists, because right now, Homeland Security is a global leader in this issue. They are the tip of the spear. They are the most well-trained, along with some of the analysts at Interpol and Europol. But we need to take that army of 7 that's sitting over there at the Cyber Crime Center, and we need to put it on blast, in the words of Senator Cornyn. And that's why we need 200 investigators and analysts to ramp up that effort and get to those 56,000 remaining children that are waiting.
And you also mentioned in your testimony the proliferation of CSAM materials, just how rapidly that material is increasing and growing. And I'd like for you to touch on 2 things. One is why these federal investigators, why this is important that it sits at HSI, and also the urgency of us actually enacting this legislation, getting this done, and getting it signed into law.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason why HSI plays sort of the most important role globally is because they have international jurisdiction. And the nature of child sexual abuse material is that it crosses both state and federal and international lines. And so the offender who is raping their child in Ohio is going to share that image with someone overseas in a country, and they may share it with someone in a country that does not have good diplomatic relations with our country. And that's why HSI's partnership with Interpol and Europol is so important, because not all countries want to share their data directly with the United States, and they need a neutral third party. So that's why Interpol's relationship in this ecosystem is absolutely vital in order to find those American children that are waiting to be rescued.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, and I thank the gentlelady for her work on this bill and other bills and legislation in this area. Appreciate it very much. Appreciate all of our witnesses being here today, and we're not going to stop till we get this under control. So thank you for being here, and with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you.